Hello, I'm Anne Forsyth, Professor of Urban Planning at Harvard University. Welcome to today's public lecture. First, a quick reminder about some features you'll see in this Zoom webinar. The chat function has been disabled so we can all focus on the presentation. Amy will respond to questions after they've finished their lecture. Feel free to submit questions into the queue at any time during the lecture by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have live captioning available for this event. To enable captions, click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Before we get things started tonight, I want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. On Monday, November 16th at 12 p.m., Catherine Yusuf will explore the ways in which natural resources as the dominant and normative modality of matter are predicated on racialized relations. And then on Tuesday, November 17 at 7:30 p.m., we'll be joined by the Black Reconstruction Collective, a group of architects and designers who collectively imagine transformations to the built environment in the Black radical tradition. All lectures will happen on Zoom and require virtual attendees to register. More information about these events, as well as how to register, is available on the GSD's website. So to the event. The Harvard Design School would first like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. So tonight I welcome a terrific speaker, Aimi Hamraie, who is Associate Professor of Medicine, Health and Society and American Studies at Vanderbilt University, where they also direct the Critical Design Lab. Hamraie is perhaps best known for her 2017 book, Building Access, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability, and is also a host of the terrific Contra podcast on disability, design justice, and the life world. Their interdisciplinary research spans critical disability studies and a number of other areas related to critical and technology studies. For those of us who are teachers, Amy is also the author of a really terrific blog post providing advice for accessible teaching in the time of COVID-19, a wonderful contribution to the community of teachers. Dr. Hamraie will talk tonight about critical access studies. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Anne, so much for that introduction. And I want to thank the GSD and the Department of Urban Planning for inviting me here today. My name is Aimi Hamraie, and I'm joining you today from the original homelands of the Cherokee, Shawnee, Chickasaw, and Yuchi peoples, most of whom were forcibly removed from these lands through acts of genocide and dispossession. And although we're here today remotely through the internet, I want to name that our subject, which is access to space, and our being here relies on relations to land, often through resource extraction, dispossession, and that we have other relationships to space that for some people are marked by racial segregation, surveillance, and policing. So as we move toward more accessible worlds, I want us to think about how we can put accessibility in solidarity with anti-colonial and anti-white supremacy struggles, particularly by Indigenous and Black people. As an access note today, I'm going to have slides with images, which I will share now. And I'll describe the images. Right now, I appear on your screen as an olive-skinned Iranian person. I present as transmasculine. I have short, dark, curly hair and round glasses. I'm wearing black and I'm in a yellow room. On this slide, I'm showing a black and white photo of the elevator lobby of the Taylor Business School, taken in the late 1970s. Inside the lobby are 3 people, 2 standing and 1 person who is seated in a wheelchair. This is the disabled architect, Ronald Mace, who is a white man from North Carolina. And on top of the photo are annotations that are made in black ink and also translucent blue ink to show the design of an accessible vestibule going into this elevator lobby. And there are all sorts of text notations and dimensional notations indicating what type of design this should be. I show this image quite frequently because it reminds us that disabled designers are part of the history of accessible design, that in fact, they have often been leaders, and that accessibility is an experimental process and outcome. It's often taking up existing built environments and changing and shaping them in some way, and that there's a politics to doing this, that every technical part of this drawing and every notation of what sorts of accessible features to include, for example, the directive that the elevator alarm have both visual and audio elements, is keeping in mind certain types of disabilities, for example, blindness or deafness. And this image also points to the historical and relational dimensions of accessible design that are being together in space as particular and differentiated bodies within spaces that may or may not have been designed with us in mind, and these sorts of cross-disability notions of access, that all of these are historically specific and produced. So as Anne mentioned, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar of accessible built environments, and I have training in critical race, disability and feminist studies, and science and technology studies. And so what I'm going to be talking about today, which is really the central thesis of a lot of my work, is the idea that design isn't just a practice of making, it's also a way of knowing. And there are histories of attempts to know disability and design for, with, and by disabled people that are also political histories that we can kind of uncover in order to have a more critical and rigorous conception of access. So the field of disability studies itself is at its core about a set of spatial theories of how bodies and spaces relate. And this goes back to the origins of disability studies in what was called the social model of disability. And this is the theory that it's the inaccessible society, not the disabled body, that is the problem, that creates a misfit between body and environment. Today, I'm going to be talking about a kind of subfield of critical disability studies that I've been calling critical access studies. And I described this in my book, Building Access, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability. And here on this slide, I'm showing a bunch of recent books that are sort of in this vein. And they have lots of different colorful covers. Many of them have the wheelchair access symbol or some other indication of a wheelchair user. Some of them show bodies in other ways. And these are books called The Question of Access, Building Access, Accessible America, Designing Disability, Design Justice, Disability Space Architecture, and What Can a Body Do? And this is really an interdisciplinary field of research around accessibility that has emerged in the last, I would say, about 10 years to create some shifts in how we think about accessibility. So because the Americans with Disabilities Act has kind of limited and spotty enforcement, so much of the discourse around accessibility up until about 10 or 15 years ago was really focused on convincing architects that they should care about accessibility and that they should embrace accessible design, that it's aesthetically pleasing, that it's cost effective and things like that. And so those literatures operate within the logics of architecture, and they try to create value for architects, which is good and important. It's an advocacy project. But if we were only to do that all of the time, we wouldn't question the assumptions about accessibility that circulate even amongst those of us who are in favor of it. And this is what critical access studies is trying to do, is to get us away from the idea of accessibility as common sense or as a de facto good, and to ask different kinds of questions about who we imagine as disabled, who benefits from accessibility, how disability and race relate in the context of spatial environments. And so a lot of this work comes from the humanities and the social sciences, and it's giving us a kind of critical account of access and the politics of spatial belonging. So on this slide, I'm showing a cover of my book, Building Access, and the background image shows a black and white drawing called an anthropometric drawing, which means that it includes measurements of the human figure, a series of these, of a wheelchair user who appears white and masculine, extending arms into space. This image appears in the architectural graphic standards. It's been there since 1981. And it's part of a longer history of studying and making knowledge claims and representational claims about disabled bodies. And so this image and the one on my first slide of Ronald Mace in the lobby kind of represent some of the ambivalences that exist around accessibility. That the need to address able-bodiedness in existing built environments may sometimes inadvertently promote an idea of disabled people as standardized, as de facto white, as nearly always physically disabled. And so thus we need a further critical intervention to open up the field of what access can mean. So I'm going to do this in 3 parts today. I'm going to start out by talking about some of the critical theories of accessibility, and then I'll touch on histories, and then on praxis. So let's talk about some theories of accessibility. First, I want to give us a little bit of conceptual vocabulary. So the ways that accessibility is often imagined operate through a disability rights framework. And disability rights primarily refers to a set of laws in the United States, and then laws in other countries as well, that include the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990. And here I'm showing a symbol that says Americans with Disabilities Act, and there are 4 squares arranged in a diamond pattern, and each one has the iconography of a specific disability. So the wheelchair access symbol, a person with a white cane to signify blindness, 3 hands that are white signing ADA in American Sign Language, and then an ear with these kinds of concentric circles coming out indicating hearing disability. And disability rights is a very specific kind of political framework. It's really based on the notion of independent citizens, economic citizens, people who work and consume, and also political citizens. For example, the idea of disabled people as a voting bloc. And the material forms that this takes are accessibility that is produced as a legal obligation. So compliance with the ADA, curb cuts, wheelchair ramps, braille signs, employment of disabled people, and then also an imaginary of disability as a kind of, as a set of standard types, as legible types, as these icons here show. In contrast to disability rights is a new movement that is also about 10 years old called the Disability Justice Movement. It's led by queer and disabled people of color. And its principles, which I'm showing on the slide, on the image on the left, are intersectionality, which is a concept that comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalism, cross-movement organizing, wholeness, which means that all bodies are good bodies, sustainability, so exercising politics without burning out, cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. And so the understanding of accessibility and disability justice is quite different than in disability rights, because it's really about creating conditions in which disabled people's lives are improving, and disabled people are understood as complex and existing at multiple intersections, and as existing in communities that create access and liberation for each other. And one of the specific movements within disability justice around accessibility is called Access is Love, and this was created by Alice Wong, Mia Mingus, and Standy Ho. And it's really an attempt to redefine access, not as logistics or as legal compliance, but as an act of hospitality and as something that is relational and cultural. So this is also related to the transformative justice movement and movements towards abolition, which I'm going to talk about later in my talk. But essentially, this is a framework that is about what kinds of relationships we want to have, how to build the foundation of a society that doesn't include prisons, surveillance, gentrification, institutionalization, et cetera. So this is a different kind of orientation, and I'm going to be kind of teasing through some of the ways that the disability rights framework was created, but also how disability justice is responding to this. So in critical access studies, a lot of the scholarly work is about kind of thinking about those differences of disability rights versus disability justice, the culture of compliance with the law versus disability culture, which I'll say in a second when I describe this image, questions of norms, power, and epistemology, and then also the dynamics of smoothness and friction, and what it means to belong in easy ways versus in ways that entail struggle, and what the comparative values of those are. So here I'm showing an image of the interior lobby of the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California. This is a building that houses the disability organizations of the Bay Area, which is an important place in the history of disability activism. And so the interior of this lobby has this bright orange ramp that goes up from the first floor to the second floor. And then it's surrounded by these images of social protests and social movements, and it's visible from the street. And so this is a kind of aesthetics of disability culture, and the ways that disabled people come together and form community and practice politics and activism, but also an aesthetics of friction. It's making known the place of disability in the space. So some of the central concepts and theories of critical access studies, the theoretical vocabulary that it gives us, include challenging normalcy. So in disability studies, this is often called CRIP theory. CRIP is a reclamation of the word cripple. And this is forwarded by people like Robert McRuer and Alison Kafer. And the question here, which is actually a motto of the disability movement, is why be normal? So questioning the value of normalcy as an imperative. There's also a lot of cultural studies, so representational and cultural critique. And certainly some of my work fits into this as well, asking the question of who counts as a disabled user. And this is work that has often been done by people who study rhetoric and visual representations of disability, including Tanya Tichkowski, Margaret Price, and Remy Yergo. And then there are these systems and political economic-based critiques. So building on the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality, scholars like Marta Russell, Subini Anama, Julie Avril-Minich, and Gina Kim ask questions like, why has disability come to be understood as white and middle class? What do public spaces, classrooms, and prisons reveal about the disability politics of space and the systems that shape it? And then also part of the theoretical vocabulary of critical access studies, because this is such an interdisciplinary field that includes not just architecture or urban planning and design or industrial and product design, but also technology in a more broad way. We have a really helpful concept that comes from Liz Jackson that is the disability dongle. And this is a well-intended, elegant, yet useless solution to a problem we never knew we had. So types of technologies that non-disabled engineers create for disabled people that are not actually that useful, like wheelchairs that climb stairs or gloves that sign ASL or that translate ASL for hearing people. We also have a theoretical vocabulary around accessibility in built environments that translates into education and technology and other fields, which is the critique of the retrofit. And this comes from Jay Dolmage, who is a rhetoric scholar. And he argues that a retrofit is when you take an existing built environment and you try to adapt it, but you maintain the fundamental structure. versus a view of accessibility as open and capacious and as a way to move, not as a finished project, and definitely not as like the end result or the final kind of world that we want to have. And then in my work, I've done quite a bit of focus on design that's by disabled people, including disabled people who are trained to be designers and people who do more vernacular and everyday forms of design. And I call this cryptechnoscience because it points to the ways that disabled people, by rejecting normalcy, also engage in ways of designing and knowing. So some of the things that I want us to take away from this part so far are that critical access studies helps us think about accessibility, not as a de facto good or as a kind of common sense, but as a type of friction and struggle, and as an ongoing and unfinished process, and as a set of ethical commitments that are grounded in a vision of a transformed world, not just a retrofitted world. So now I want to turn to historicizing access studies. So before there was critical access studies, there was access studies. And what is this about? And what has it told us that is useful and perhaps that needs revision? So access studies emerged in the post-World War II era when an influx of disabled soldiers returning from war and numerous survivors of the polio epidemic constituted a category of physically disabled people, many of whom faced barriers in the built environment. And the reason that they faced barriers was another historical condition that I call the normate template, which is the default position of an able-bodied, often white, strong, enduring, body as the focus of architectural design as the default. So here I'm showing two sets of images. One, dimensions of the human figure on the left shows a bunch of bodies, extending arms into space, sitting, standing, climbing. And there are these dimensional notations next to them. This is the information that was in the architectural graphic standards for about 40 years before that image of the wheelchair users that's on the cover of my book. And then on the right is where the data for these types of images comes from. This is Harry Laughlin, who is a eugenicist and worked for the United States military and did anthropometric studies of soldiers. And they look almost identical. It's like Laughlin is measuring the soldiers standing, sitting, bending down, reaching next to a skeleton. And this data was taken to standardize military uniforms, but also to judge the physical fitness of bodies. And then it made its way into design and architecture. And it builds on a 19th century practice of anthropometry associated with the Belgian astronomer Quetelet, who is shown here. And he was the person who, he used data from soldiers as well in the 19th century to come up with the categories of body type that today are associated with body mass index. So this kind of, so-called science of body size and health has its origins in these eugenic practices that then also made their way into design. And one way that they did that was through the work of a design firm called Henry Dreyfuss Associates. And here I'm showing an image of Alvin Tilley, who was an ergonomist. And he took data from military studies and from home economic studies. And he drew these figures that product designers would then be able to use as they created cockpits and door handles and whatever they were creating. And so the two figures are called Average Joe and Josephine. And I like this image a lot because we see Tilley as kind of, he's sort of like this young white man wearing khakis, and he's standing next to these data-driven, but kind of like ideal bodies and figures. And he looks quite different from them because he's a real person and they are statistical fictions. So that is the world that access studies emerged to critique. And as I said before, in the post-World War II era, there was suddenly so many disabled veterans and also polio survivors who were trying to navigate built environments and faced barriers. And this happened to be at the same time that the federal government made funding available through the GI Bill to allow some disabled soldiers who are white and often middle class to attend colleges and universities in the United States. And so some universities created these programs for disabled veterans that were then opened up to disabled civilians as well. And one of the most well-known of these was at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And so at this university, students engaged in these research processes. Their bodies were measured. In the image on the left, there's this kind of experimental ramp outside that can be moved up and down and made wider or have more or less slope. And there's a man in a wheelchair going up the ramp, and then another man who's standing off to the side documenting it. And this was data that was used to decide how steep a ramp ought to be for accessibility codes. And then the other types of research that they did were focused on domestic space. And so on the right is an image of a white disabled woman, wheelchair user, in this kind of experimental kitchen where the functionality of the kitchen is being measured through her reach and ability to get under the tables and things like that. And so it's the data from these very specific bodies that shaped the first accessibility standard in the United States, which was called ANSI, which is ANSI, A117.1. And then this was exported all over the world and adopted or qualified in different places. But it's really important to understand that this standard was not created by taking account of a wide range of disabled bodies. It was these two figures, these heterosexual cisgender figures that were kind of making up the imaginary of who would live in public spaces and in suburban homes. And it's also really important to note that this research was done during the Jim Crow era, and during a time of rampant racial segregation, even in Illinois, which was not in the South. So the outcomes of the research and the types of accessible spaces created at this university were still highly racialized, and the types of spaces that they created codes for, which included churches, homes, public transportation, were places that were still segregated. And at the same time, the claim was frequently made by proponents of accessibility at this time that when we create accessible spaces for disabled people, everyone benefits. So it's a kind of design for all, but it's not really designed for all when it takes place under these conditions of racial segregation. So the other thing that I want to mention about this is that this wasn't just a student program designed to get students to go to college. It was also part of a rehabilitation program. Rehabilitation is a field that started to emerge during World War I and expanded. And it basically focused on returning disabled bodies to a state of quote unquote normalcy, and working with a number of other fields like occupational therapy and gerontology to make this happen. And it had a very specific politics that continues to shape disability rights today. This is a quote from Leon Chatelain, who was the chair of the AIA and the president of the Committee on Architectural Barriers for the Handicapped in the mid-1950s. And he said, most important is the day when we use the tremendous power of the rehabilitated physically handicapped that is now going to waste. For instead of being dependent on public assistance, they will be gainfully employed in buildings which are freely accessible. The economic potential is enormous, but more important, we will have people who are happy because they are at work in productive, useful occupations. They may truly be a burden, but frequently it is not their fault. It is the lack of awareness of the public, of the general public, that has created this difficulty. So what we're seeing here is that the logics of rehabilitation were shaping the reasons to have accessibility in the first place, that we should make spaces more accessible because then disabled people will be able to be normalized and no longer be quote unquote burdens. And so these logics are basically indistinguishable from the work of eugenicists and industrial managers that were working in the early 20th century. These ideas of burden that needs to be resolved through making citizens more productive. And even though they're kind of diagnosing the built environment rather than the person as the problem, they were still perpetuating the idea that normalcy is an imperative and that productivity is the only thing that makes someone a worthwhile citizen in society. Something that's kind of weird about this to me is that later disability studies kind of adopted part of this idea, saying that it's not the disabled person that's the problem, but the inaccessible society. But as I'll discuss in a second, it came with a different political orientation. So the last thing I'll say about rehabilitation very quickly is that because accessibility standards were created through this specific framework, this specific way of knowing disability, it gave the impression that accessibility is something that you can measure scientifically, and that is standardizable and that's knowable and has a finished outcome. And so what this left out was a view of accessibility as kind of an ongoing process, as a place of friction, and as something that maybe is not evenly distributed across the population or that people may need in different ways. So the field that I'm calling critical access studies is more contemporary. It's from the last 10 or 15 years. But ultimately, it is exploring ideas that came about in the 1960s in response to that first wave of access studies. If you've seen the documentary on Netflix called Crip Camp, you may know that a movement of disabled people emerged from within spaces of rehabilitation in the 60s and 70s. And this was because people who had similar impairments were kind of sharing spaces for the first time. But they had an explicit response to rehabilitation and the imperative of normalcy. And in places like Berkeley, California, and Denver, Colorado, there were direct action groups, like radical disability groups that formed around what was called the independent living movement. This is language that they had borrowed from rehabilitation, the idea that disabled people ought to live independently. They borrowed this language so that they could access and divert funding that was available in this field toward projects like mutual aid, design led by disabled people, and also the fight for disability civil rights. And they really fought against rehabilitation professionals and called them out on the ways that they were trying to normalize disabled people. And they worked with architects and urban planners to do certain kinds of design work. So on this slide, I'm showing the cover of the book, Design for Independent Living, The Environment and Physically Disabled People by Ray Lefshay and Barbara Winslow, two architects who taught at UC Berkeley in the College of Environmental Design. And the cover shows a bunch of images of these sort of hacks that disabled people created to be able to turn on a light or a sling to get out of bed or different tools for writing. And the book studied these as a kind of design expertise. And it took a very political position. So the image on the right comes from this book, and it's of a protest. It's kind of like 1970s, hippie protests, and people have long hair and they're seated on these stairs. And there's one person who's seated in a wheelchair. They're singing. And there's a sign being held up that says, everybody needs equal access. And this was a response to the idea from rehabilitation that only productive bodies deserved access. So in Lefshay and Winslow's book, they tried to translate for architects why this all mattered. They said, is the objective to assimilate the disabled person into the environment, or is it to accommodate the environment to the person? Currently, the emphasis in barrier-free design, which is accessibility, is on assimilation. For this seems to assure that the disabled person, once broken in, will be able to operate in a society as a regular person, and that the environment will not undermine his natural agenda to improve himself. This assumption can be counterproductive when designing for accessibility. It may serve only to obscure the fact that the disabled person may have a point of view about the design that challenges what the designer could consider good design. Many designers have, in fact, expressed a certain fear that pressure to accommodate disabled people will jeopardize good design and weaken the design vocabulary. Though certain aspects of the contemporary design vocabulary may have to be reconsidered in making accessible environments, one must also look forward to the new items in the vocabulary that will develop in response to these human needs, ultimately leading toward more humane concepts of what makes for good design. So some of the examples of design that came from this movement include this activist designed wheelchair ramp by Eric Dibner from the late 70s on the left. It's drawn in ballpoint ink on lined paper, and it shows basically like the materials, the shape, the slope of how a home in the community could be made more accessible so that disabled friends could visit. And on the right is a chunk of concrete that is in the permanent collection at the Smithsonian. And this is from a protest by the disability activist group called ADAPT from 1978, in which activists used sledgehammers to smash up inaccessible sidewalks and pour curb cuts or ramps with bags of cement as they were publicly protesting. So this is a kind of part of the legacy of like guerrilla urbanism that's in disability studies and in disability activism. And Lipshay and Winslow were drawing attention to the ways that when disabled people engage in politics, there's also often this like world building component and design component that is critical. It's not about assimilation, it's about anti-assimilation. So some of the other things that are interesting from this book are, for example, the idea of non-conforming uses. So this image of a power wheelchair user in the street going against the flow of traffic because the sidewalks are inaccessible. And then also, and this isn't from the book, but it's from the same milieu, these works of activism within the urban planning profession. So Ruth Grimes, who was a planning student at Berkeley, did some advocacy with the independent living movement around getting a curb cut route in the city, and used this map, which Bess Williamson reprinted in her article, The People's Sidewalks, to show what such a route would look like and how inaccessible some of the commercial areas had been previously. So in the 1980s, some really interesting things started to happen when disabled architects, including Ronald Mace, who was on my first slide, started to graduate from architecture school and try to challenge some of the conventions and representations of disability in different ways. So this is a product that Mace used when he was developing his idea of universal design, which is that design for disability can also benefit non-disabled people. And it's called the Huey Saturn. It's an architectural drafting table, and it is adjustable, and it says it's usable. It trains handicapped and unhandicapped people with equal ease. So there's an image of kind of like an androgynous white woman architecture student who is indicated as the unhandicapped, quote unquote, person, using the same table as a Black disabled man who is a wheelchair user and has an afro. And there's this kind of, the name Huey Saturn is a reference to the Black Panther Huey Newton. So this kind of representation of a Black disabled person as someone who would be an architect, as well as a white woman who would be an architect, as a kind of, like an extension of social protest movements and freedom movements into the architecture profession. And based on these, Mace worked to challenge some of the iconography of disability. He really hated the wheelchair access symbol because it was so generic and not very dynamic. And so he took photographs of his wife, Lachlan, and superimposed them on each other. She was also a wheelchair user. So in the upper left corner, there's this kind of image of like a woman in a wheelchair, and it looks like she's in movement. And then Mace and his cohorts also drew in disabled people of color into their accessibility handbooks. So there's an image of a Black blind woman with a white cane who has kind of short hair going down a street past a mailbox. And then this other image of 4 people standing in front of a full-length mirror that says it works well for everyone. And this includes a Black woman who's standing, a Black man who is sitting and shaving, a young white girl, and also a poodle. And so there's this kind of like interspecies idea of accessibility as well, but kind of like an attempt to show that a range of different types of people can use the same sort of technology, and to do it in a way that's deliberately different than some of the images of disability and access that existed in previous times. And I want to say about this, of course, it doesn't do anything to actually address structural racism. It's more about the representation of disability. So this is not really how disability access was represented in the broader culture. However, after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, there was sort of this idea that the law had solved the oppression parts of ableism. And so there should be more of a focus on marketing and products and the consumer market. And that idea of like the productive citizen now being one who consumes. And something that I found that is just really kind of bizarre, but very interesting is there's a lighting company called Leviton that markets its universal design products in the same booklet or pamphlet as its security and surveillance products. And so this shows 2 pages from that. And on the first page are these sort of like suburban McMansions with lots of images outside. And there are like white children playing with their dog on the lawn. And it's a very racialized and securitized view of lighting and the home. And it talks about things like safe haven and peace of mind and home security. And then on the right side, randomly, there is this photo of 3 generations of a family. And their race is kind of ambiguous. I would say that the people who are represented are light-skinned. And the reason why this is meant to be a representation of universal design is that there's a grandfather. He doesn't seem to visibly like have a disability, but the existence of kind of like the multi-generational family is meant as a stand-in. So this is what Alison Kafer calls a depoliticized approach to disability. It's like taking disability and euphemizing it and making the most palatable version possible in order to market a product, which of course has all sorts of implications for how we think about like who is not represented here, both in terms of the homes that are being idealized as sites of security and lighting, and as the families that are being shown. So this all kind of helps us understand a little bit about how the concept of access evolved through specific forms of knowledge from the rehabilitation field, how it was contested, but also how some of those norms are still circulating around like who is a disabled person and for whom is access. And this takes us back to some of the theorists that I talked about in the beginning, for example, Tanya Tichkowsky, who says that access is really a space of questions regarding who belongs where, under what auspices or qualifications, and during what times or through what particular thresholds. The activist Mia Mingus, who's a disability justice activist and also a leader in the transformative justice movement, calls upon us to change the framework of access away from logistics and toward meaningful justice and accountability. And she describes this as a culture that makes inaccessibility impossible. And so I want to now turn toward just giving us some examples of where frictions exist around these different conceptions of access, and how there may be some differences between how critical access studies approaches these questions where they have been typically approached through an access studies framework. And in all of these, we can kind of ask ourselves, where are the alignments with disability justice or with access studies? The first is in the area of code and compliance. So when I started my job at Vanderbilt in 2013, there was this narrative that the campus was 100% ADA accessible. So anytime someone raised an accessibility concern, the answer was like, we comply with the law, we don't need to do anything that goes beyond that. And so I wanted to challenge this narrative, and my lab started a project called Mapping Access. And we wanted to do three things. We wanted to get people who may believe this narrative to go out and survey the campus and see firsthand, was it actually true? So there's an image here of three people looking at a survey inside of a classroom building and holding out a tape measure and surveying the campus. We wanted to question the primacy of the code, especially the legal codes, which we knew to be inadequate and shaped by these very constrained conditions. And so we worked with different groups on campus, including groups of disabled people, but also like queer and trans students and Black students, organizations, and the Women's Center. And we created what we called a radical standard and a new kind of checklist that went beyond the code, but also encouraged people to ask really hard questions about the spaces that they encountered and really figure out if they could even judge whether a space was accessible or not. And then we hosted these mapathons, and here's like the poster for one of them. It has this kind of like black map dot with a star on it. It says Accessibility Mapathon. Where we had hundreds of people come out to these various events and go all over the campus and collect data. And this had a really interesting impact, which was that a bunch of people, like hundreds of people, suddenly learned to read the built environment in a different way and realized it was inaccessible and that they didn't really know anything about accessibility. So it had this kind of critical dimension. And it caused the university to take on its own mapping project and then start a strategic planning process that would cover 40 years to make the campus more accessible. And so I was on the task force for that strategic plan. And we did all kinds of cool stuff. Like we expanded the university's building code. We came up with kind of new typologies and new ways of doing things. If the front of a building wasn't accessible, we would re-landscape to make the accessible entrance the front of the building. And one of the things that was built from that code, which I'm showing here, was a solution to historic buildings. There are two kind of brick buildings with columns on the outside. It was impossible to put elevators in them. And so a glass building was built between the two to create an accessible circulation space that would make these other buildings more accessible. I was really excited about this. And then I went and took a tour of the building while it was being constructed, and now it's done. And this is what the interior looks like. There's this staircase that's the main feature. It takes up kind of all of the space. It has seating on the staircase itself. And then there's an elevator tucked into the back. So this space that was supposed to be a space of accessibility became a space celebrating staircase instead, which is an inaccessible form. And there are actually parts of it that are inaccessible because you can't get to the seating areas that are off of the staircase itself if you are a wheelchair user. So this happened because the campus simultaneously had a commitment to building new buildings according to a building certification regime called WELL, which is part of the Living Building Challenge. And it's focused on sustainability and health promotion. So there was a choice that was made to promote exercise in the built environment as the central aesthetic and functional feature of this space. And this is very different than that image of the Ed Roberts campus I showed earlier. And so this, illustrates some of the frictions where we did our best to go beyond the code, but what that meant was that, this building became possible that then had this really ableist staircase featured in the middle of it. Similar kinds of frictions come up for me in the research that I'm doing now on public space and public life. I've been doing ethnographic research with urban designers for several years in the new urbanist movement and people advocating for more bikeable cities. So on the left, there's an image of an open streets event where people are allowed to bike in the street and access businesses that way. And on the right is what is called a complete street, which includes a bicycle lane protected from the street by trees, a sidewalk, and then the street itself, a kind of multimodal mobility. And there's a huge debate within urbanist circles about questions like, is it ableist? Does it prefer able-bodiedness when we design cities that are mostly for these forms of active transportation? Are we assuming that everyone has access to these forms of mobility? And this could really go in a lot of ways. I think there are good arguments in many directions. But the sort of access studies approach has been to say, oh, no, this is fine because it complies with the law. This street is legally compliant with the ADA. Whereas critical access studies would ask us to question how the figure of the disabled user in public space is shaped by histories of race, class, gender, and also kind of literal forms of accessibility. And so I want to give a shout out to someone who has influenced my thinking about this a lot, Gabrielle Peters, who's a disabled journalist and transportation expert in Vancouver. And she wrote this great piece about how in these debates by non-disabled planners, usually disabled people are kind of used as political volleys in convenient ways. But these questions really about how ableism works and how it intersects with other systems are not really addressed. And this aligns with some of the ideas that are coming out around mobility justice. This is a quote from the Untokening Collective and their principles of mobility justice. It says, safety, which is the focus of a lot of efforts at pedestrianization, safety is more important than protection from cars. When people live at the intersection of multiple vectors of oppression, unfettered access to mobility and public space are not guaranteed. Racism, sexism, classism, ableism, xenophobia, homophobia, and constraints imposed upon gender nonconforming folks can make the public space hostile to many. Bodies encounter different risks and have different needs. So here we kind of see some of the influence of some of those critical access ideas on the framework of mobility justice, but really put into conversation with the ways that public space is racialized. So one argument that I've heard made quite persuasively is that if you have bicycle lanes, that doesn't actually prevent the police from doing surveillance or arresting someone or harming a Black person who is perceived to be doing the wrong thing in public space. Also related to this is a set of analytics that come out about housing justice and issues faced by unhoused people. And the late disability justice activist Stacey Milburn actually wrote about this quite a bit. So this image shows a number of tents that are on a city sidewalk. And this is because of a housing crisis in the Bay Area. And Stacey, who lived in the Bay Area, called the responses to this kind of condition access washing, because she said that the people who lived in the tents who are unhoused were receiving citations for violating the ADA, for failing to comply with the law by blocking the sidewalk. But that many of those people were actually also disabled themselves. So in the process of enforcing the ADA, some of the most marginalized disabled people were being harmed. And she called this access washing because it wasn't an act of solidarity between disabled people. It was the imposition of one set of standards upon other disabled people without consideration of how race and class affected access to housing. And the ADA citations do not improve access to housing. So she called us instead to think about ways of forging solidarity and recognizing housing access as a disability issue. And then finally, I want to just touch briefly on carceral politics and abolition, because so much of the thinking around critical access studies has been informed by people in the transformative justice movement, including Mia Mingus. Here I'm showing two images. One is of a prisoner who is a wheelchair user going through a gate that's being held open by a corrections officer. And this is a kind of representation of the sort of politics of disability in prisons that says that, okay, there are disabled prisoners, and so we should make prisons more accessible so that they can accommodate the disabled prisoners. We'll have universal design prisons. Whereas a kind of disability justice informed approach may ask why we have prisons or institutions at all and how we can end the pipelines that feed them. And so the image on the right is by the artist Micah Bazant, B-A-Z-A-N-T, and it says, disability justice means resisting together from solitary cells to open air prisons. To exist is to resist. And it shows a Black woman wheelchair user who's a prisoner, presumably in the United States, holding hands, locking arms with a Palestinian woman who is a double amputee. And so these examples of kind of the difference between the universal design prison and these solidarities that recognize the role of state violence in producing disability, but that also call us to think about how disability and race intersect and what sorts of solidarities and opportunities there may be, are also very relevant for designing built environments in the same way that architects have often refused to design spaces of solitary confinement, thinking critically about access and accessibility issues and how it shapes all different sorts of carceral institutions, including the types of institutions where people with mental and intellectual disabilities are held, becomes like its own kind of imperative. And so I want to just like end there with having us think about how critical access studies can be a commitment to abolition and transformative justice in creating the kinds of worlds that we want to exist. And doing that in a way that also challenges the ways that capitalism and structural racism shape who we understand to be disabled. So I will end there, and I look forward to talking to you all in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was terrific. And I have a lot of questions, but I have to let some of the audience ones go first. So the first question we have actually nicely brings together your ideas of technoscience and the diversity of disabilities. And it is, could you talk about any examples of disabled-led design projects specifically addressing deafness?
Yeah, thank you for that. So there's a project right now at Gallaudet University that's called Deaf Space, and it's a kind of new design language for deaf culture. And so I am not an expert on deaf space, but a few things that I have learned about it include that Gallaudet had or currently has an architecture school. And so there is a history of developing deaf spaces in that university, which is the only deaf university in the United States. It's in DC. And some of the ways that deaf space is informed by deaf culture have to do with the ways that, the architects did research with the community to figure out, like, you should have round classrooms where people can sign and see each other and things like that. But there's also critique of it from deaf-blind people who attended Gallaudet, because some of the things that would have made spaces accessible for deaf-blind people were not present in these kinds of deaf space typologies, including just kind of like the ways that the curvature of the space didn't announce what was coming up. And so it created navigation problems. And so that's an example too of how there's diversity within the population of deaf people. And some of those design projects that are based in certain forms of deaf knowledge may not actually like include everybody.
Thank you. The next question goes to the issue of aging. Lauren Hansen says that she noticed what's represented in the ADA logo and icon also seems to have a relationship to aging, visibility, mobility, hearing, and so on. She wonders if you have any thoughts on cultural reverence for youth and the productive body, and aging as related to notions of disability, that is, who is considered disabled and who has a productive body.
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you so much. So I'll say that there's a really complex relationship between aging and disability and the figure of the aging body, because gerontology and the practice of design for aging also comes from rehabilitation in that same history that I talked about. So at the same time that you have this idea that we should have accessibility because it produces more productive citizens, we have the idea that we should have accessibility because older people will also be able to maintain their longevity and their endurance and stamina. And there are even environments that are kind of like these obstacle courses. Like if anyone's ever heard of the architects Arakawa and Gins, they literally designed design against aging, these spaces that were supposed to make you more like agile and all of those things. And so much of what I see today too, in terms of design for aging, is really focused on rehabilitation and not so much on accepting aging bodies as like, natural and normal, and that like there may be things about bodily capacities that change and trying to adapt to that. And so, the focus on productivity has all sorts of implications for aging people. And one that we saw recently was, the doctor who may be in the Biden administration who thinks that we should all get euthanized when we're 70, because at that point we would stop being productive members of society. And so, disability justice really agitates against that idea that we have to be productive even in order to stay alive. And we can see how design might be influenced by these ideas as well.
We have another question, this one from Gareth Doherty. To what extent does neurodivergence or cognitive difference, things like ADHD and dyslexia, factor into critical access studies and disability design? And also perhaps in relation, can you speak more about the positive aspects of disabilities and how the majority can learn from people with disabilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are these kinds of like very medical and again, rehabilitative approaches to designing for cognitive disability. Sometimes they're in the context of healthcare architecture. So there's a lot of like designing for dementia, for example, that fits exactly into that framework I was discussing before with aging. And then more recently, there are some attempts to think about accessibility from a more like neurodiversity perspective. And so this is things like sensory information, lighting, the layout of a space. And I'm just like waiting for some autistic architects to graduate from architecture school so that they can make new ways of designing spaces that are more radically inclusive, because so much of the built environment is really inaccessible. And I think that this is like an area to watch, and it's still very much in formation. And then the second part of your question was about like positive aspects of disability. Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I've got it.
It's okay. I found it. Or no, maybe I didn't. Yeah, so I mean, I'm a disabled person, and I think that's a very positive thing. And part of it has to do with the knowledge and experience that disability brings, even when you don't fit into society. and that often that is like forgotten. And so in that example that I showed from the book Design for Independent Living, a lot of what they were trying to do was to say, look at all this invention and adaptation that would not have been possible without disabled people's experiences of like hacking and tinkering with the built environment.
Thank you. I forgot to read out the name of the person who asked the first question. It was Johann Dietrich. So I'm caught up. We have a question from Hannah Wong, who is a disabled design student at the GSD and really appreciates your thoughtfulness. So she has some questions. As a disabled designer, how would you recommend promoting accessibility in the built environment without being pigeonholed only as designing for the disabled community? And what are the most common relevant misrepresentations and assumptions about disability in the built environment today? And then she also wants to know how how people with disabilities can find each other, given the lack of data.
Yeah, great questions, Hannah. So I would say for your first question, which is how to avoid being pigeonholed, I would avoid the route of not talking about disability or euphemizing it, which is often what happens, and instead to focus on solidarities and intersections. So I think that like, if you're in the position to be able to show how accessible design can also make us think differently about white supremacy and address it differently, then that's like a great way to show that accessible design has broad relevance for disabled and non-disabled people, and it has these like justice-driven imperatives. I think some of the most common misconceptions and assumptions about disability in the built environment just have to do with like the erasure of disability in so many ways. And that example that I showed where disability was conflated with aging, but there was no clear understanding of what sorts of barriers existed. That is a kind of representation of disability that ought to be challenged, and it can be challenged by showing a greater diversity of disabled people. There's also, of course, there's been this longstanding issue of accessibility being conflated with design for wheelchair users. And in some ways, that's not a bad thing because the world is really inaccessible for wheelchair users. Like that needs to continue to be a focus, but it needs to be broadened as well. And I hope that the codes will eventually reflect that. And you're totally right that there isn't enough data on designers with disabilities. And there is, thankfully, a huge network of people who know each other on social media and things like that. You can follow my lab on social media, which includes a lot of disabled designers and we create a podcast interviewing disabled designers. And that's kind of a way of getting people to connect with each other and to know each other.
Well, actually, going on that theme of designers, Eric Larson asks, what role should non-disabled designers play in making spaces accessible?
Thanks, Eric. So I will give the same answer to this that I would give to designers in any kind of design field. So this can include architecture, urban design, but also technology design. And part of it is like figuring out where to start and what your commitments are. And hopefully after this talk, you can kind of understand some of the differences between disability rights and disability justice in terms of what accessibility looks like. If you're working on a specific project, like making sure that disabled people are involved from the beginning and accessibility isn't just like a one-off feature. And then reading the work of disabled scholars and disability activists who are working in design, I think there's like a huge knowledge base. Like all of those books I showed on the second slide, those all kind of came out at the same time. And so overnight, there was like this field of study that didn't previously exist, and it's there for you to learn from and use it.
I'm going to go to one of the more complicated questions because it raises some issues I was thinking of as well. This one comes from Joseph Grigley, but I'm going to paraphrase and add in my question as well. I was struck at how universities had had a strong role in shaping the way disabilities are thought of and how access is thought of. And Joseph points out about this activism, and I'm thinking for good and for bad, the University of Illinois, Lachey and Winslow, your own lab. But Joseph talks about how, the staircase at Vanderbilt or Berkeley has this history of disability activism and scholarship, yet Berkeley didn't make its online material accessible. So, what's the story with universities? Is there one story? And actually, I wanted to know how we can be on what we can do that's positive from the perspective of universities.
Yeah, I love this question because I think of universities as a site of labor, just like any other labor site in which we may intervene if we were trying to unionize or do some other kind of activism. And there are things about universities that are very predictable in terms of how they behave and what motivates them, and where some of the spaces are for intervention. And just like the law, if you want like legal recognition for a civil right, it's going to take a really long time to make that happen. But there are ways that access gets created in these smaller ways and spaces, and influence can happen and leverage exists through the relationships that we forge. And so, I'm struck by this example of how, like these universities got sued by the National Federation of the Blind and also the Deaf, like for having inaccessible websites at the same time that they had accessible buildings and architecture. And that is something that like people within the university probably ought to have caught and addressed in a different way earlier, but it's also like a totally resolvable thing. And it's resolvable through like the kinds of relationships that are built that say, like, actually there are members of our community who need these forms of access and we need to create them. And so it's kind of like a culture issue. And that does take a long time to build, but once it's made as part of the culture of the university, it's harder to get rid of it. And one way to think about that is like now that we have all these events on Zoom, we often have live captioning, not all the time. I mean, I insist on it when I give a talk, but like, I'm pretty sure the other talks in this series had it too. And so that's just like part of it now. That's what we do. It's part of the culture of conducting these university events. And it's kind of on all of us to create those cultures where we are and figure out like who has access to the money and resources and who has control over that, and then just make it a norm. And if it's not a norm and there's resistance, to figure out like how you may influence that space like in a different way. And that's something that I actually learned from studying the history of disability activism at universities. Like I kind of just like took what they did and replicated it in my own projects.
Sasha Constanza-Chock has given us a couple of questions about smart cities, talking about them as a space where accessibility will improve through surveillance systems and information and visualization for city managers. And so how does critical access studies interface with like urban science, a smart city, and so on?
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. This is such an important question because I think there's so much danger around this. And there's this kind of principle that comes from some parts of disability studies that the opposite side of the coin of access is surveillance. And so thinking about like how forms of accessibility that require monitoring and data may also enable forms of surveillance to happen if we're not careful with them. And there's like a similar discourse around like artificial intelligence and stuff. I don't really have like a good solution to this so much as to say that critical access studies can kind of like combine forces with critiques of surveillance culture and critiques of the smart city to think about this differently in some way, and in some way that's influenced by critiques of racial capitalism, for example. And I really hope that somebody does that because I think it's actually pretty urgent and timely.
We actually have a couple of questions that build on this, thinking about, the disabilities and the challenges. Elisa Nagan talked about the difficulties or the approaches for designing for invisible disabilities, cognitive or otherwise, and what are the challenges and how does that intersect with the critical access studies?
Yeah, so one of the ways that it intersects is that because so much of the history of disability activism focused on physical disability and so much of the research focused on physical disability, the accessibility codes are very much still concerned with certain kinds of physical disability. Not entirely, but there are also new types of disability that arrive in the world or that become known, and it takes a while for the codes to catch up. And so an example of this is multiple chemical sensitivities. There was a movement in the 80s of people who were like, the built environment is making us sick, and this is an accessibility issue. And you can read about this in Michelle Murphy's book, Sick Building Syndrome. But that's not really something that the ADA codes address, right? So it then becomes a question of how to make it legible so that then the codes can address it, but also how to create norms and practices around spaces that we do have control over, like asking people not to wear fragrances when they come to events and things like that.
Actually, the next question is actually will be quite interesting. Katarina Trott is wondering about your thoughts on critical disability studies, intersections with nature and the environment.
Yeah, thanks, Katarina. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot because I also work as a permaculture designer. And so I'm really interested in the ways that disability is figured in environmentalism, like sometimes like in bad ways. Like there's this whole history of eugenics in the environmentalist movement and the Sierra Club and all of that. But then also if you shift to a kind of regenerative framework that says essentially that like all bodies are good bodies and ought to be sustained by the environment, and that there ought to be abundance and not thinking around scarcity and things like that, then you kind of get different outcomes sometimes. And I just published a paper about this in the journal Environmental Humanities, where I read these works of speculative fiction that were focused on urban design and permaculture. So imagining these permaculture cities. And one of the interesting things about the permaculture cities was that they had accessibility as one of their central principles. And so I was kind of thinking about like why that is, and it came from this idea that you can't have a truly regenerative society if you're excluding people on the basis of their like physical or mental or other capacities. So I think that there's a lot there. And then there's a lot there to challenge too, that's about these historical ways that the environmentalist movement has, adopted principles that are to the detriment of disabled people as well.
Actually, Corey Richtenberg has quite a good question about how can we make accessible design intersectional, understand the issue, but beyond policy and advocacy, what can we do in design to make a difference?
Okay, so in terms of like specific design decisions or something like that?
Yeah, I actually can see that. Can you give some examples or what kind of sensibility or way of thinking would it mean? Actually, Gerard Babylon asks, can you talk a bit more about a culture that makes inaccessibly impossible? What does that paradigm shift look and feel like? What might it take to get there? And I think Corey wants you to sort of ground it in design, but Gerard just wants you to talk about the whole culture shift.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that there are multiple parts of this. And one of the things that I'll say, and if you read my book, you'll get a sense of this, is that a thesis of my work is that designers don't just make things. They also do all of this other stuff that constitutes the broader milieu of design. So that includes like doing research, it includes doing advocacy, writing curricula, shaping licensing guidelines. All of these things actually make up what design is and what kinds of worlds are built. And so what happened in the history of disability access was that disabled architects figured this out, and they were like, we're going to go to the AIA and we're going to write these continuing education seminars where we teach people how to talk to disabled people. Or we're going to create this curriculum where we train architecture students to develop real relationships with the communities that they want to work with, and not just have these kinds of extractive and exploitive relationships to them. And to me, that is the vision of transformative justice too, and like creating the kind of world that we want to create through relationships that are more grounded in like ethics and consent, and disinvesting from the types of institutions that are not helpful to us. All of those are design decisions. And then, you know, there are these things that can happen kind of more in terms of like the everyday design decisions. So one example of intersectionality that was kind of an accident, I think, in many places is that many wheelchair accessible restrooms are also single user gender neutral restrooms. And so it became possible for trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people to have a safe restroom to use just because that existed. And it wasn't like the perfect restroom, and there's all this great like prototyping and stuff that's being done to make it even better. But it did highlight this issue of multiple use, that there are different kinds of people who can benefit from this kind of design. Something that came up around the mapping access project that I was talking about that was really interesting to me and totally made sense, but I hadn't thought about it before because it wasn't part of my experience, was that the Black students said, how can a building be accessible when it's named after like the Confederacy? Like we literally had a building called Confederate Hall on campus. And so part of the design decision was how to like change that, which actually meant advocating with the university. And then the university had to come up with like $2 million to pay the Daughters of the Confederacy who had donated the building in order to change the name. And these are the things that designers did, like the architect, campus architect took it on, like that kind of stuff. And these are all part of the design process.
That's good. We just have a few more questions and a few more minutes. So I thought there are two by Dee Wu and Alexandra Sigarel that sort of go together. Dee wanted to say that you mentioned that the movement started from convincing designers, the accessibility movement, but there are places where disabled persons are still not considered as users. So how can we go about raising awareness about the complexity of disability? And can you give an example of how that translates into different practices of design? I do think you've talked a bit about it, but Alexandra raised a sort of similar question about improving accessibility amongst those who are homeless, which is a kind of one of those exact complex kind of situations.
Yeah, so we can think about this kind of in terms of activist strategies. So like what sorts of things are people doing and what is effective and what's ineffective? And I have this chapter in my book where I evaluate this and I say like, look, these are all the ways that architects experimented with getting greater knowledge of disability to their clients, to other architects, to manufacturers, and what worked and what didn't work. And the things that really did not work were trying to euphemize disability or to hide it or to downplay disability as like an issue of rights and justice. Like that really didn't work, because what you got instead was like that sort of advertisement with the lighting and security and stuff like that. In my experience, what really does work, and I have been lucky to, I talk to designers in all sorts of capacities, like all the time, is to highlight disability as a movement and a culture. And that helps people understand what it means to create justice-driven design a lot better. Because if you understand the history of disability and that disabled people are like an excluded minority, then it's not just about the functional aspects of accessibility, it's also about interdependence and community. So you can't just like focus on one type of disabled person anymore, because they're going to bring their friends and they're going to say like, okay, but in our community, we always do these things as the baseline of accessibility. And so that has to be present too. And so I think for anybody who wants to do advocacy in this area, like the most important thing you can do is to become acquainted with disability culture and community and follow it. And there are, again, like all sorts of resources that you can use to do that. And I'll just touch briefly on the question of designing for like unhoused people in shelters and stuff. To me, this is a little bit like the prisons, like accessible prisons, like really like the project of disability justice ought to be to get housing access to everyone, not just to create shelters that are more accessible, although like clearly that should be the case too. No one should be excluded from a shelter if they are disabled. But there are these like broader policy and economic questions that designers can take on as well.
And actually, there's a perfect final question from Martina Siventek. How do you see a field such as critical access studies growing? Does it have space broadly in academia, or does the push for these ideas need to come from a grassroots activist position?
Thanks, Martina. I'll say that these ideas came from activism, and activism leads disability theory. And so some of what I'm doing is kind of translating it into academia, but there's like a back and forth exchange. And I think that, the grassroots is the experimental field of all sorts of design as well. And so I would hope that it would continue to grow in both of these places.
Well, with that, we're actually a minute over time. So I'd like to let everyone get to whatever they're doing at whatever time zone they're in. Thanks, Amy. That was terrific. And I can see that I've had lots of little bits of chat from students who are very appreciative. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Great. Bye-bye.